Hey folks, tonight we're starting with a question that usually gets lost in the smoke of tanks, trenches, and total war. What exactly did World War II soldiers eat? From American rations to German ersatz spreads, Soviet cabbage soup to Japanese rice balls. We're digging into history, one tin of corned beef at a time. Before we dive in, take a second to like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy the content. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious about who's tuning in from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe flick on a fan for some background hum, and let's settle into tonight's story. Long before tanks rolled across Europe or bombers roared through the skies, every army faced the same stubborn, unglamorous obstacle: how to feed millions of soldiers without poisoning them. Let's be real, when we picture World War II, we think of heroics, battles, and grainy newsreels. We almost never ask the gritty questions like, did the guy storming Omaha Beach have breakfast? And if so, what was it? Spoiler alert, not pancakes. Feeding an army wasn't a culinary project, it was a logistical nightmare sprinkled with dysentery. Rations had to be portable, long-lasting, cheap, and ideally not disgusting. Taste ranked somewhere below 1T explode if dropped, and 1T attract rodents. Each nation had its own approach. The Americans leaned on science, producing little boxes of hope called rations. Early in the war, the Germans sent troops out with hearty bread and sausage, but by the later years replaced it with something closer to edible punishment. The British clung to tea like it was the glue holding their empire together. It probably was. The Soviets boiled cabbage with religious devotion, and the Japanese often fought on nothing more than rice balls and grit. Food was more than fuel, it was morale. A hot meal could boost spirits, while a cold, greasy tin could crush them. Some soldiers, weirdly, grew to like their rations. Others swore lifelong hatred for hardtack. Many dreamed not of medals or victory, but of butter, fresh bread, or literally anything that didn't come wrapped in brown paper, while generals strategized over maps. Privates in foxholes were swapping chocolate for smokes and praying their buddies wouldn't snore through dinner call. Because tonight, we're not talking about borders, battles, or treaties. We're talking about Spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the real war. Man versus ration tin. 'Cause no matter where you fought, one rule stayed true: everyone had to eat, even if the food fought back. Alright, imagine you're a US soldier in World War II. You've marched 10 miles, dodged bullets all morning, and haven't seen indoor plumbing in weeks. Your stomach is making noises that could register as artillery. What's waiting for you? A ration? A compact, calorie-packed cardboard miracle designed by people who probably never tasted one. Here's the breakdown. The ration came in 3 brick-sized boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They technically provided nutrition, while emotionally preparing you for combat through sheer disappointment. Breakfast, tin of ham and eggs that resembled neither. The texture, imagine Spam fused with drywall. Add some tooth-cracking crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade. Why? Couple sticks of gum, and 4 cigarettes. Because nothing says balanced breakfast like a Marlboro. Oh, and 1 sheet of toilet paper. Just 1. Make it last. Lunch wasn't kinder. Maybe you got cheese spread that contained more chemicals than dairy, another pile of Jawbreaker biscuits, and a chocolate bar dense enough to double as tank plating. No spoon, no issue. You'd improvise with a knife, a stick, or pure frustration. Dinner usually meant a helping of meat and beans, which often resembled a crime scene sealed in a can. Alongside it came yet more crackers, more gum, and, if you were lucky enough to have earned divine favor, a tiny fruit bar that tasted like someone had whispered the word apple over a piece of cardboard. Still, rations were nutritional workhorse, around 3,000 calories a day, crammed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough flavor to make sure you didn't accidentally enjoy yourself. Soldiers quickly turned mealtime into a marketplace, trading components like inmates swapping cigarettes, chocolate for smokes, cheese for crackers, anything to escape ham-related trauma. But every once in a while, you'd stumble on a Hershey bar. Real chocolate, real comfort. For a single bite, you weren't slogging through mud. We're home. Hey, and that alone made the rest of the rations almost bearable. So yes, the ration was dry, square, and tasted vaguely like despair. But it fueled an army that marched across continents and helped win the war one questionable meat product at a time. The ration was the military's idea of a meal. The ration was their idea of a cruel joke disguised as dessert. The ration looked like chocolate, was packaged like chocolate, and was issued as chocolate. But that's where the resemblance ended. This wasn't a sweet little Hershey's kiss. This was survival in brick form. It had been designed with the Army to meet 3 requirements. 1. Resist melting. 2. Last forever. 3. Taste like hopelessness. It was about the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to stop a bullet. Some soldiers swore it lived forever, either in their packs or in their digestive systems. On paper, the ingredients were perfectly normal sugar, cocoa powder, oat flour, a dab of cocoa fat. In reality, the result was a brown slab that could double as a bludgeon or emergency building supply. Why engineer such misery? Because the bar had to survive jungles, deserts, and frozen fronts without turning to goo. And the military wanted it deliberately unappealing, so soldiers wouldn't eat it unless they were desperate. Mission accomplished. The thing was so hard that biting into it cold could send you straight to the medic with cracked teeth. Some troops grated it into boiling water. Others just glared at it in confusion. Legends say a few used it to hammer tent stakes. But hay had calories. Roughly 600 a bar, enough to limp through a day of fighting. Physically, it might save your life. Emotionally, not a chance. To be fair, the Army did eventually tweak the recipe to make it slightly less like chewing gravel. But the damage was done. The first version was remembered with all the affection of a root canal. So the next time someone chirps, chocolate makes everything better, remember the ration, the bar that proved them wrong. If the ration was survival food, and the D ration was edible punishment, then the field kitchen was a soldier's only real chance at something hot, vaguely familiar, and not entirely soul-crushing. K2, these mobile kitchens, nicknamed rolling misery wagons, were hauled behind trucks or horses, serving as the Army's attempt at dining out. And by dining out, we mean not cold, not canned, and not actively trying to break your teeth. They churned out industrial-sized vats of stew, beans, mystery, gravy, and oceans of coffee strong enough to keep an entire battalion awake through an existential crisis. Meals were dished out cafeteria style. UD, shuffle forward with your trusty metal mess kits, something that looked like it belonged in a laboratory experiment, while silently begging the cook not to run out of the good stuff before your turn. The process was precise. One ladle for you, one suspicious glare from the cook, and then move along. The menu varied depending on where you were stationed. In Europe, you might find yourself staring at creamed, chipped beef on toast better known, and permanently renamed by the troops as SOS, that officially stood for stuff on a shingle, unofficially. A far less polite translation. In the Pacific Theater, if fortune smiled on you, dinner wasn't just rice floating with random hot dog scraps in a thin broth. Coffee, however, was sacred, was brewed strong, bitter, in an amount big enough to wake the dead. Soldiers drank it any way it came, boiling hot, ice cold, black, or cut with powdered milk. As long as it kept them upright and irritable, it did its job. The best part of field kitchens. The smell drifting over camp pit meant food was on its way. The worst part? Literally everything else. Meals were eaten outside, often in pouring rain, stinging snow, or ankle-deep mud that looked like its own ecosystem. Seating was whatever you could find. A rock, your helmet, or a bare ground. Forks didn't exist. Atmosphere didn't exist. Just you, your squad mates, and a dented tin of beans that might predate your commanding officer. Odd. And yet, if it was hot and vaguely chewable, field kitchen food felt like a small miracle. It wasn't glamorous, but in a world of chaos, bullets and boxed rations, it was the nearest thing to comfort food a soldier could hope for. At the outbreak of World War II, German troops marched off with confidence, spotless uniforms, and shockingly food that looked like actual meals. Compared to what other armies were choking down, the Wehrmacht's early rations were practically luxurious. Soldiers' packs held rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. Well, Erzal's coffee, but more on that abomination later. Each man was expected to carry enough provisions for a couple of days. It's a nice idea until you factored in rifles, ammo, grenades, and frostbite. Still, German logistics emphasized 3 hot meals a day, with field kitchens trailing close behind like overworked food trucks. Breakfast might be dense rye bread with jam or butter, washed down with roasted Dacorn coffee. Lunch often meant canned meat, cheese, and maybe a few boiled potatoes. Dinner, assuming you weren't under bombardment, could be soup or stew from whatever had been moving that morning. Sausage, especially Metwurst and Leberwurst, was a staple easy to carry, full of protein and vaguely comforting. Unfortunately, it stank to high heaven inside a tin, which meant trenches reeked of iron, sweat, and pork spices. And of course, the Germans had bread, real bread. Soldiers later said they missed it more than they missed beds. One veteran recalled ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. Field kitchens reinforced this system, doling out steaming stews, boiled meats, cold, and dumplings whenever supplies allowed. Morale stayed high, bellies stayed mostly full, and German efficiency looked unstoppable. But there's always a but. This early golden era didn't last. As the front stretched farther and supply chains snapped under pressure, sausages soured, bread hardened, and field kitchens ended up stranded in frozen woods with nothing but icy potatoes and fading patriotic slogans. For a short bratwurst-filled season, though, German soldiers enjoyed something rare in war: warm meals, decent substitutes for coffee, and the comforting illusion that it would all be over by Christmas. As the conflict dragged on and Hitler's blitzkrieg fantasy dissolved into logistical collapse, rations nosedived. The age of Ersatz, German word for substitute, though fraud would be more accurate. By 1942, real coffee was gone. In its place, Ersatzkaffee, a bitter cocktail of roasted acorns, chicory, sugar beet, or barley, smelled like misery and tasted like someone boiled socks. It resembled coffee only if you had never had coffee before and didn't plan to start. Bread, once hearty and sustaining, was bulked up with fillers, wood shavings, straw flour, potato starch, or whatever could be ground to powder. Technically bread, but your teeth might disagree. Soldiers joked it worked just as well as helmet padding. Butter disappeared too, replaced by ersatz margarine, a pale, greasy spread that was somehow both chalky and oily at the same time. Meat became a rumor. Cans labeled meat product started arriving, but no one dared ask what animal it came from. Even sausages, the pride of German kitchens, got corrupted horse meat, then turnip filler, eventually up to 40% plants. Biting into one could feel like chewing on damp newspaper. Welcome to the Reich's culinary decline. And it wasn't just a taste, okay? These ersatz rations lacked calories, nutrients, and morale. On the Eastern Front, men burned thousands of calories daily in sub-zero conditions, while being fed food that couldn't sustain a dachshund. Hunger, illness, and desperation followed. Soldiers improvised, boiling leather, bargaining with locals, or raiding enemy stores. A single American chocolate bar was worth more than a stack of Wehrmacht bread. What had once been a slick, fuel-driven war engine was now sputtering along on cabbage broth and caffeine propaganda. The Germans began the war eating proper meals. By the later years, They were gnawing on despair and chasing it with roasted roots. If food had a graveyard in World War II, it was the Eastern Front, stretching thousands of miles from Berlin into Russia's frozen gut. Supplying it was like trying to run a pizza delivery business across a glacier while under fire, shelled, and occasionally mauled by wolves. Soldiers who once enjoyed sausage and rye ended up hunched in snowdrifts, stomachs growling, fingers too numb to open a tin. Rations shrank, supply lines collapsed, and morale froze faster than the soup, which is to say, it never thawed at all. It's about that soup. Dinner often meant hot water with a couple potato skins if you were lucky. Not, it was just water, solid ice by the time it reached you. Bread, moldy, if it showed up at all. Meat, a rumor, usually. Canned goods were thawed over firewood or engine blocks, sometimes revealing beef, pork, or just concentrated disappointment. If the label had worn off, you had to trust your nose and hope it wasn't horse. Men boiled snow for water, heated tins on tank engines, and sometimes ate snow straight out of desperation, only to learn that it dropped their body temperature and brought them closer to dying with a mouthful of slush. Rats thrived, fat and bold, feeding on scraps the soldiers couldn't spare. Some men trapped and cooked them. Others fought the rodents, like rivals in midnight skirmishes history books politely skip over. Barter became survival. Cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, socks for half a potato, spoonful of jam could spark a fistfight. Chocolate made you a king. Yet even in the hunger, soldiers cracked jokes, cursed their luck, and ate whatever they could scrape together. Every mealtime was a ritual. Open the tin, mutter a prayer, and hope it didn't fight back. If German troops dined on misery, Soviet troops survived on sheer willpower. The Red Army's food philosophy was simple. If it filled the belly and didn't kill you instantly, it was dinner. The official ration book promised black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat, porridge, a boiled potato or two, dried fish maybe, and endless unsweetened tea. In winter, that tea was usually melted snow with a stick in it. Its meat existed only on paper, as rare as hot baths in Stalingrad. When it did show up, it was so salted that chewing it was more workout than meal. Still, soldiers prized it, licking the grease off old tins just to remember what fat tasted like. Bread was the anchor of every Soviet meal. Dark, coarse, made of whatever grain wasn't banned for use. Portions were tiny, barely enough to cover your palm and vanished in 2 bites, lest you eked it out by licking it like a tragic war lollipop. Cabbage was the true MVP. Soup, stew, pickled, stuffed if it came in a pot, it had cabbage. Troops joked they could smell it in their dreams, some wishing they could reincarnate as turnips just for variety. Deliveries were supposed to be daily. As combat zones, they were more like, if ever. Soldiers improvised. They dug frozen potatoes from abandoned fields, shot wild animals, or bartered boots and cigarettes for an egg. Some even traded with German post food for silence. Still, the Red Army marched on, malnourished but unbroken. They fought on fumes and cabbage water, proving that sometimes endurance is fueled less by calories and more by cabbage-powered stubbornness. When rations failed completely, Soviet soldiers didn't fade quietly. They adapted with desperation and creativity that bordered on madness. Pictured yourself outside Leningrad. No supply trucks for a week. Cabbage soup, now just water with a leaf floating in it. Your last crust of bread, growing a beard. Options: forage berries, bark, boiled grass, dandelions, even flower bulbs. 1 unit roasted shoe leather. Not because it was tasty, it wasn't, but because it was technically organic. Or barter. A pair of socks might fetch you a potato, a broken watch, maybe a spoon of lard. Tobacco was money. Soap was treasure. Tin of meat that could buy you a letter home and a cleaned rifle. Or theft, politely rebranded as unauthorized logistics. Red Army men raided abandoned German camps for food. One veteran recalled bursting into tears after finding a crate of Wehrmacht sausages the first time he sobbed and drooled at the same time. Field kitchens, when running, made mystery stews of whatever turned up beets, onions, unidentifiable meat, pickled vegetables from another century. The soup was hot, red, and sometimes alarmingly chewy, but it kept you upright. And yet, morale never collapsed. Why? Because Soviet culture treated suffering as proof of resilience. Its hardship wasn't just endured, it was worn like a badge. Soldiers made jokes about their rations, sang tunes about dried fish, and even gave names to their tin cups, whether out of camaraderie or mild starvation-induced madness. For the Red Army, meals weren't about taste, they were about performance. Every scrap of bread, every ladle of beet soup was a statement. We're still here. If World War II had been judged on food alone, the British Army might have surrendered to its own kitchen. British soldiers didn't eat, they endured. Their rations were a daily trial, bland, repetitive, but always accompanied by boundless optimism and an industrial supply of tea. Let's begin with the sacred trio: tea, hardtack, and bully beef. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was morale in liquid form. Soldiers brewed it in mugs, mess tins, helmets, or anything that held hot water without leaking too badly. Often it came without milk, sugar, or dignity, just hot brown water and determination, but it carried men through. Hardtack biscuits were nearly indestructible, cakes, chalky, and tasteless. They had the durability of construction material. Troops joked that their dental problems came not from combat, but from gnawing on these edible roof tiles. Then there was bully beef, canned corned beef. It looked like pet food and felt like regret. Salty, greasy, and oddly gelatinous. It could be eaten cold, fried, or stared at until your hunger gave up. Alongside came powdered eggs that tasted nothing like eggs, jam that doubled as glue, tins of oatmeal, chocolate, and dried fruit, all sealed inside metal cans that required a crowbar or divine blessing to open. The British Army never claimed its food was good, only that it was adequate. And to be fair, it kept men alive. Field kitchens sometimes turned out stews, prunes, or rare luxuries like fresh bread or eggs. But regardless of the menu, there was always tea. Shells might fall, trucks might explode, but if water boiled, there was a brew. And in that steaming mug sat Britain's real ration: stubbornness. By the war's middle years, British troops weren't just battling the Axis, they were battling ration fatigue. Supply chains stretched across continents, meaning the farther from London you went, the stranger and soggier the rations became. In Cairo, a meal might arrive warm and edible. In Burma, it might show up moldy, chewed by ants, and weeks overdue. Yet, soldiers still boiled it, salted it with sarcasm, and ate it. Tea was sacred. Men risked sniper fire to save a kettle. A single cup could mean the difference between collapse and composure. With supplies short, troops improvised rehydrating powdered milk into tea whitener, spreading jam on biscuits with bayonets, or inventing stews of corned beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin tablets. The results were questionable, but technically, food. Tinned goods were both miracle and curse. They lasted forever, but often took brute force and a miracle to open. Soldiers developed strong opinions about which tin designs were merciful and which were tools of Satan. Whenever fresh food did appear, an egg, a loaf of bread, a vegetable, it caused either celebration or suspicion. One soldier gifted a tomato, kept it as a pet instead of eating it. Despite tasteless rations, broken teeth, and jam-induced jaw locks, the British soldier stayed stoic. They muttered, joked, and chewed their despair quietly so long as there was tea. If the American soldier had rations, the German had precision, and the Brit had tea. Then, the Japanese soldier had rice and a terrifying tolerance for hunger. The Imperial Japanese Army built itself on endurance. Self-denial was noble, suffering was duty, and hunger was expected. Convenient, since most soldiers were nearly always starving. The standard field ration was more suggestion than sustenance. Rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, soy concentrate, and maybe a hard candy or two. Neat, compact, familiar, but not enough. Troops began with neatly packed bento-style tins, but once in the jungles of New Guinea or Burma, rice spoiled into green mush, rats chewed through supplies, and dried fish rotted overnight. Japan's logistics were a nightmare. Supply lines were bombed, blocked, or simply forgotten. Many units went days, even weeks, with only handfuls of rice to share. Soldiers scavenged, raided villages, or ate jungle plants some edible. Others, hallucinogenic, lizards, insects, rats, anything that moved might end up in a pot. One soldier recalled boiling grass and leather just to quiet his stomach, and yet they rarely complained. Hardship was considered honorable. Starvation was endured like a medal. Weevils in the rice. Extra protein, spoonful of miso paste or powdered green tea was a treasure. Salt could bring tears to a grown man's eyes. Calories were few, but discipline carried them farther than their stomachs could. They weren't just underfed, they were trained to accept it. The Pacific jungles looked lush from a distance, like paradise if you ignored the disease, leeches, and ever-present stench of rot. In reality, they were green prisons. Supply lines collapsed in storms, blockades, and ambushes. When food didn't arrive, the jungle offered little help. Plants looked edible, but weren't. Animals were edible, but too fast. And insects were inedible and often bit back. Rice molded overnight. Tins rusted shut. Meat spoiled before it was cooked. One soldier in Guadalcanal wrote, "Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp." Lucky soldiers ate boiled roots, wild fruit, frogs, or the occasional jungle fowl. Unlucky ones gnawed bark, chewed palm stems, or drank water flavored with despair. Some boiled the same rice 3 times to leach out every last calorie. Others fermented leftovers into a gooey paste known only as jungle glue. And in the darkest corners, there were whispers-verified accounts of cannibalism in cut-off units. Rare, but real. Men pushed to their limits by combat, isolation, and the hollow roar of empty stomachs. If anything strips away the illusion of glory in the Pacific, it's that grim little reality. And where starvation went, disease followed. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, made worse by malnutrition. Countless soldiers didn't fall to bullets, but 2 slow, unseen killers like hunger and infection. The jungle didn't care who your flag belonged to. Didn't feed you, it didn't protect you. It simply waited until you wore down, and then it consumed you. War may reduce cities to rubble, but it also sparks the desperate creativity of starving men armed with bayonets and a single tin of Spam. Across every battlefield, soldiers didn't just eat rations, they negotiated with them. They swapped, bartered, stretched, crushed, fried, and occasionally treated the better parts like sacred relics. Food was fuel, but it was also distraction, morale, and sometimes a reckless science experiment. In American foxholes, G is turned Karashian crackers into makeshift pancakes, mixing them with powdered eggs and coffee whitener, then frying them over small flames. The result tasted like defeat, but warm defeat, which counted for something. Canned cheese was melted into greasy paste and poured over beans to form trench fondue. Spam was sliced, fried, and stuffed between biscuits to create the world's most depressing sandwich. Even chewing gum was repurposed to seal leaking canteens or bribe a buddy for an extra smoke. British troops, armed with their indestructible biscuits and magical tins of jam, made jam buddy sandwiches by smashing the 2 together until their jaws surrendered. One unit in North Africa mixed bully beef with dried fruit and optimistically called it Desert Delight. Another named their nightly stew simply stuff, because no one, not even the cook, could identify what was in it anymore. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers boiled cabbage in helmets, used empty shell casings as soup pots, and roasted anything with legs, including a stolen German sausage that had to be guarded by 3 men. Even the Japanese, with meager supplies, invented small tricks, refrying rice with pickled vegetables to form onigiri-style cakes, or saving scraps of dried seaweed to flavor hot water when nothing else remained. These weren't feasts. They were survival experiments. Field improvisation transformed monotony into morale. Not enough into this will do, and made terrifying meals just a little less dreadful. Because when you're stuck in a trench, a jungle, or a shattered farmhouse, your mess tin becomes your stove. Your bayonet becomes a cooking tool, and every bite feels like a miracle that you lived long enough to take it. And when the fighting ended, when rifles were stacked, uniforms packed away, and medals locked in drawers, what lingered with veterans wasn't just the battles, it was the food, or more precisely, the memory of it. For many, rations became more than sustenance. They were the backdrop to trauma, humor, friendship, grief, and survival. A bite of corned beef could summon a muddy foxhole in France. The smell of cabbage soup recalled the frozen trenches near Stalingrad. A can of Spam wasn't just canned meat, it was a moment carved out of history. Veterans remembered meals with grim laughter. American G's joked about chewing through a ration bar as if it owed them money. British soldiers told stories of trying to trade their rock-hard biscuits with civilians, only to be laughed at. One Soviet veteran admitted he couldn't touch bread for years afterward, not from disgust, but because to him it felt almost holy. Food marked the edges of war. A fresh apple meant farmland, maybe peace. Steaming bowl from a field kitchen meant you'd live another day. Even a bad cup of coffee meant someone had cared enough to boil water. And above all were the care packages, the treasured lifelines from home that carried not just supplies, but hope. Chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, and handwritten notes slipped beside batches of cookies. These weren't just snacks, they were lifelines. Some soldiers guarded them like treasure. Others split them with their comrades. Few rationed them out bite by bite, stretching hope across weeks of misery. But not every taste was welcome. Some lingered too long. Veterans later joked they could still taste the metallic temps of the cans decades afterward. One G swore that every time it rained, the smell of Spam came back to haunt him. Another claimed his nightmares occasionally featured powdered eggs, 'cause eating in war wasn't only about feeding the body, it was about clinging to humanity in a world unraveling. Every bland, greasy, or strange-tasting meal became part of you. So the next time you casually toss a snack into the microwave, picture those soldiers cooking over campfires with bayonets and sheer grit. For them, each mouthful was survival, and the flavor never truly faded. The ink was barely dry on the U.S. Constitution when the young nation faced its first internal crisis, not sparked by foreign armies or political rivals, but by something far more intoxicating: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was broke. The Revolutionary War had left the country drowning in debt, and the new federal government, led by President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, needed revenue fast. Hamilton, always the strategist, proposed an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, most notably whiskey. 2 merchants on the coast. It sounded fair. But on the western frontier, it felt like a slap from powdered wig elites. Out there in rugged places like western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just alcohol, it was currency. Farmers converted extra grain into whiskey because it was easier to move, lasted longer, and brought better returns than raw crops. They traded it for tools, clothes, and services, right? So when the government began taxing it, Frontier families saw it not as policy, but betrayal proof that distant authority was creeping back, the very kind they had fought a revolution to overthrow. The tax code only rubbed salt in the wound. Big distilleries could pay a flat yearly fee, but small batch farmers had to pay by the gallon. In short, the little guys paid more. And when federal tax collectors arrived on horseback to enforce the law, resentment boiled over. At first, resistance was almost comical. Inspectors were threatened, tax papers burned, and officers firmly told to get lost. But soon, polite turned to violent. Tehran featherings returned. Taxmen were chased out of towns. One unlucky official was stripped, tied to a tree, and had his hair hacked off. Rough justice spiked with whiskey-fueled rage. Washington watched quietly at first, but not for long. What began as a tax protest was sliding toward armed revolt, one that would test both the Constitution and Washington's willingness to defend it. By 1792, the whiskey tax wasn't just disliked, it was despised. In Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, grumbling turned into organized defiance. Taxmen became acquainted with the sound of shattered windows and the crack of musket fire overhead. Western Pennsylvania soon stood at the center of what was openly being called rebellion. Taverns and log cabins became meeting halls where kegs of homemade whiskey stood beside loaded muskets. These weren't just drunken complaints, they were organized assemblies. Locals raised militias, threatened federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions against the tax. Some refused to trade with anyone who paid it. It was equal parts protest, mafia, and moonshine. By 1793, violence escalated. Collectors and sympathizers were ambushed, beaten, and publicly humiliated. One man was paraded through the streets with a sign labeled "Coward" hanging around his neck. It looked less like civic dissent and more like the Boston Tea Party, but drunker, dirtier, and meaner. Federal courts issued summons for the rebels, but serving legal papers in regions where sheriffs sided with mobs was nearly impossible. Law and order was collapsing. Washington, usually calm, began grinding his false teeth. Rebellion threatened not just public peace, but the very authority of the federal government. Still, Washington didn't charge in recklessly. Tease and negotiators to reason with the rebels. But it was like trying to host a tea party in a brawl. The rebels had already formed committees, held conventions, and in some corners even muttered about secession. They didn't see themselves as criminals, but patriots resisting tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the hardliner, whispered in Washington's ear, "You really going to let these guys trample the Constitution? After everything we fought for?" Last, Washington made his choice. He would raise an army not against the British, but against Americans. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had evolved into a direct challenge to federal authority. Washington, hero of the Revolution, now faced the surreal duty of leading an army against his own people. This wasn't some ragtag group either. He called up over 12,000 troops, nearly triple the force he'd commanded at Trenton. Units from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania answered the call. Some volunteered, others were volunteered. It was the largest federal force yet assembled in U.S. history, and its target wasn't foreign troops, it was angry farmers with muskets and moonshine stills. Hamilton, relishing the drama, rode along like a powdered wig Patton. For him, this was proof that the new government had muscle. Washington, though grim, understood the stakes. This was about more than whiskey. Rebels could intimidate taxmen and ignore Congress without consequence. Then the Constitution itself was meaningless. So, for the first and only time, a sitting U.S. president took the field at the head of an army. Picture the scene: the most famous man in America riding westward through the Alleghenies, not to inspire liberty, but to crush rebellion. His presence alone sent the message this government would answer defiance with bayonets, not pamphlets. And when the army reached the rebel heartland, the response was anticlimactic. The loudest agitators melted away. Others fled into forests or claimed ignorance. No epic battle, no dramatic showdown. The rebellion dissolved like weak cider. Washington's show of force had worked. The message was clear. The federal government was real, and it wasn't to be trifled with. The army marched back east. Washington returned to Philadelphia, but the cleanup punishing offenders, reasserting law, improving federal authority was only just beginning. Their voices were drowned out by wealthier urban politicians who had no idea what life was like west of the Appalachians. Add to that a tax that disproportionately punished small producers, and the whole thing smelled less like economic policy and more like class warfare with the stink of whiskey. There was also the matter of how the law was enforced. Wealthier distillers could afford lawyers, paperwork, and the annual flat fee. The poor guy with 1 still and 6 barrels of mash, you got a federal marshal and a potential prison sentence. The optics were terrible and the anger was real. In this way, the rebellion was an early warning sign. Class tension wasn't going to disappear just because America had a constitution. If anything, the struggle between wealthy power centers and rural working communities was baked into the cake. The Whiskey Rebellion was just the first slice. Interestingly, some of the most radical rebels even adopted the language of the French Revolution, which was happening around the same time. They spoke of liberty, tyranny, and the rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, that kind of rhetoric was terrifying. The last thing they wanted was a Paris-style bloodbath spilling into the Ohio Valley. But to the whiskey rebels, those words weren't dangerous. They were a promise, one they felt had already been broken. George Washington's decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was as bold as it was risky. At the time, many Americans saw the presidency as a somewhat distant, almost ceremonial role, a sort of executive moderator for a government still figuring itself out. But with this march, Washington shattered that image. He was no passive figurehead. He was an active enforcer of federal power. For Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion was a test not just of law and order, but of the very legitimacy of the federal system. He had helped design the Constitution, and now he was putting it to work. If he failed, if he allowed violence and intimidation to override legislation, the whole project might unravel. 13 separate states could quickly decide they were better off going their own way. The rebellion, in that light, wasn't just a backwards tantrum. It was the canary in the Democratic coal mine. Washington's personal involvement added enormous weight. His reputation was nearly mythical. He was the father of his country, a man revered by veterans, respected by citizens, and feared by enemies. When word spread that Washington himself was riding west, many rebels melted into the landscape. Some couldn't believe it. Washington was the hero of liberty. Now he was marching on citizens over whiskey. But the gamble paid off. Washington didn't need to fire a single shot to win. His presence alone restored order, and he knew when to stop. Once the rebellion dissolved, he withdrew. He didn't occupy the region, didn't punish the masses, didn't turn it into a show trial. Just reminded everyone firmly that the law was not optional. Yet, not everyone applauded. Some, especially in the Jeffersonian camp, accused Washington of using military force to silence legitimate political dissent. They painted the march as an overreaction, a flex of executive muscle that could have turned ugly fast. Even some Federalists worried. What precedent had just been set? Still, the rebellion's swift collapse allowed Washington to exit the presidency on a high note. He had enforced the law without becoming a tyrant. He had shown strength without cruelty. But quietly, Washington understood this wouldn't be the last time America's unity would be tested, and next time the outcome might not be so bloodless. Although the Whiskey Rebellion ended with barely a whimper, its echoes rippled far and wide politically, legally, and culturally. In hindsight, This dusty conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional stress tests in U.S. history. First, it set a critical precedent. The federal government had the right and the ability to enforce its laws, even in the face of violent opposition. Before this, the Constitution had been more theory than reality. Articles of Confederation had shown how weak and toothless a decentralized government could be. And now the Constitution, with Washington's boots on the ground, flexed its newfound muscles. But with that power came a lingering fear. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, began to see the federal government not as a representative of their will, but as a distant Eastern elite that didn't understand or care about frontier life. The very same people who had once cheered the revolution now whispered about oppression from Philadelphia and New York instead of London. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became legend in the Appalachian Hills. Stories were passed down of brave distillers standing up to federal agents. Some were exaggerated, some romanticized, but all carried the same message. Government doesn't always have your back, and if you want something done, sometimes it takes more than a vote. It takes a still, a rifle, and a few angry neighbors. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a new capital being planned during the rebellion's aftermath, lawmakers were taking notes. Future leaders would reference the Whiskey Rebellion every time civil unrest threatened the balance of the republic. Was this the model? Rapid show of force followed by clemency, or a dangerous precedent of executive overreach? And then there was the whiskey itself. Ironically, despite the rebellion's failure, the tax never worked. It was expensive to enforce, widely evaded, and politically poisonous. By the early 1800s, under Jefferson's presidency, it was quietly repealed. The rebels lost the battle, but in some twisted way, they'd won the war of public opinion. The frontier didn't forget. Neither did the government. And future presidents would face their own rebellions, both large and small, with the ghost of 1794 riding just behind them, reminding them that order is fragile and that the republic is always one barrel away from boiling over. The Whiskey Rebellion may seem like a curious footnote today, a quirky chapter in the early American story, but its legacy remains surprisingly alive, swirling like vapor off a still, spilling everything from presidential power to rural resistance. For one, it showed the American people that the Constitution wasn't just parchment and promises, it had muscle. This was the first time the federal government enforced a domestic law with troops, and the fact that it did so under the personal leadership of George Washington gave it historical gravity. Every president since has inherited that precedent. Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent presidents deploying the National Guard during domestic unrest. All trace a faint line back to 1794 and a president on horseback. The rebellion also injected lasting skepticism into the heart of American politics. Frontier distrust of centralized government became a core part of U.S. political identity. It didn't matter that the rebellion failed. It proved to millions that distant elites could and would flex their power when it suited them. That spirit of rural defiance. You can still hear it in antacs, protests, states' rights arguments, and the deep American love of local control. In short, the rebellion planted seeds of resistance that never quite died out. They just fermented. Whiskey itself, believe it or not, also reaped a strange legacy. Far from being demonized, it became a symbol of independence and grit. The very substance that sparked a rebellion is now toasted in bars as a proud American tradition. The American whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious roots like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebellion leaders, bottles designed to evoke frontier spirit, and slogans that practically dare the IRS to come knocking. Again, and finally, the event taught a young country something fundamental. How it responds to dissent says everything about its identity. Washington chose both force and forgiveness. That balance, power tempered by principle, became a cornerstone of the American ideal. Not always followed, of course, but always referenced. So next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, it's not just liquor in that bottle. It's a story of power, protest, and a young republic figuring out what kind of country it was going to be. Cheers to the rebellion that helped define a nation. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon etched his now famous code into a massive basalt stele, a towering legal monolith meant to his subjects and assert divine justice. It's one of the earliest known attempts to formalize laws in human history. But buried within its 282 articles lies something just as ancient as law itself. It's the regulation of women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman wasn't just a person. She was a role: daughter, wife, widow, mother. Each of those roles came with a legal definition, a social expectation, and if things went sideways, a punishment. For example, take marriage. Women could be married off by their fathers, essentially transferred from one household to another. Once married, a woman was expected to be faithful. If she was accused of adultery, both she and her alleged lover could be bound and thrown into a river. That's not metaphor. That's literally what the text prescribes. However, if her husband decided to spare her life, the court often agreed. It's romantic in a grim sort of way. Meanwhile, if a man cheated on his wife, King Hammurabi didn't seem all that concerned. Male infidelity wasn't exactly headline news in Mesopotamia. The imbalance was stark. Female honor was family honor, while male honor was more flexible. But not all the laws were oppressive. Some provisions offered women surprising protections, especially widows. A widow had the right to remain in her late husband's house and manage his property until her sons came of age. If there were no sons, she could even inherit directly. In that way, Hammurabi's code recognized a woman's capacity for financial and legal responsibility, but only within the strict bounds of family structure. There were also laws about divorce. A woman could leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but proving it was no small task. Her claims couldn't be verified. She could be branded a liar and punished severely. Justice wasn't blind, It just squinted harder when the accused wore a veil. So, what did Hammurabi's code teach us about women in ancient Babylon? That they weren't invisible. It's far from it. They were named, categorized, judged, and occasionally protected, but always through the lens of control. Law gave them a place, but rarely the power to shape it. Travel a few hundred miles west from Babylon, and fast forward a few centuries, and you arrive in ancient Egypt, a civilization where the scales of justice were personified by Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. And unlike many of their neighbors, the Egyptians had a surprisingly progressive view. At least on paper, when it came to women's legal rights. Egyptian women, whether rich or poor, had the legal right to own property, inherit land, sue and be sued, and even initiate divorce. These weren't just theoretical rights etched on tomb walls. They were practiced, particularly in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. Women could enter contracts, serve as witnesses, and leave wills. A woman could run a business, lend money, or purchase slaves and livestock. In short, Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals, not just extensions of their husbands. This autonomy might seem ahead of its time, and in many ways, it was. Women weren't locked out of temples or courts. In fact, priestesses played important legal and ritual roles, and some even served as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom show women filing complaints against male relatives and winning. But, and there's always a but, this relative legal freedom came with social constraints. Most women still lived under the authority of a father or a husband, and while they could own land, they were often expected to pass it down through male heirs. The law said yes, but society often said not quite. Marriage, though not a religious institution in Egypt, was still legally binding. Husbands and wives could divorce for reasons as varied as infertility, infidelity, or even emotional music incompatibility. Divorce didn't carry a social stigma, and children were usually cared for by the mother, who retained rights to her dowry and often received additional property. Its punishment under the law was theoretically equal, but practically speaking, class and connections mattered far more than gender. A noblewoman could get away with things that would send a peasant woman straight to the crocodiles, literally. So, was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not exactly, but compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia or later Greece, it offered women something rare: the ability to participate in legal life as people, not just property. In a world ruled by gods and pharaohs, that was no small thing. In ancient India, the legal world of women was governed by Dharma, the moral and social order at the heart of Hindu philosophy, codified in texts like the Manusmriti, laws of Manu. This framework offered a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system where women were honored, protected, and respected so long as they stayed in their place. The Manusmriti, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, had a lot to say about women. Much of it contradictory. On one page, it declared that where women are honored, the gods rejoice. On another, it warned that a woman must never be independent. The tone swung between reverence and restriction, between divine praise and domestic captivity. Women were legally bound to male guardians throughout their lives: father during childhood, husband during marriage, and sons during widowhood. This triad of male control wasn't just cultural, it was encoded into law. Autonomy was not the ideal, obedience was. Marriage laws were especially rigid. A woman's primary duty was to marry, bear sons, and serve her husband faithfully. Widow remarriage was generally frowned upon or outright banned depending on the caste and period. Sati, the infamous practice where widows were expected to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre, was not universally enforced, but found moral validation in some legal and religious texts. The Manusmriti didn't command it, but it also didn't condemn it. That said, there were exceptions. Women of the upper castes sometimes received education and could inherit property in the absence of male heirs. In some regions and periods, matrilineal traditions survived, particularly in the South. Women could serve as advisors, poets, and even rulers, though these were rare and usually exceptional. Divorce was rare and generally disapproved of, though certain grounds like impotence, cruelty, or abandonment were sometimes recognized. It was the man who had more legal freedom to cast aside a marriage. Its punishments, too, were gendered. A woman caught in adultery could be disfigured or outcast. A man, he might get a fine or a slap on the wrist if he had high status. In short, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in layers of veneration and restriction. They were sacred, but sacred like a temple statue, not like a free citizen, revered, but rarely empowered. When we think of ancient Greece, we often imagine democracy, philosophy, and drama. But for half the population, women, the legal system was less about ideals and more about invisibility. Especially in classical Athens, women were legally seen not as individuals, but as permanent minors, bound to the guardianship of their nearest male relative for life. In Athenian law, women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They could not enter contracts or even leave the house without a male escort. In many cases, if the Code of Hammurabi defined women as legally subordinate, Athens perfected the art of locking them out entirely. Marriage was more of a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's curios, usually her father or brother, arranged her marriage, and she moved into her husband's household as part of an exchange of dowries and land. Legally, she was transferred like livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men. And yet, paradoxically, her fidelity was of enormous legal importance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could legally divorce her immediately, and any man caught with her could be executed. Yes, executed, without trial. The irony, her husband could sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal repercussion. Double standards weren't just common, they were built into the legal structure. Women couldn't initiate divorce themselves, but they could return to their father's house if abandoned or mistreated. However, any legal action on their behalf had to be taken by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, a woman could not bring charges. Her Kio had to speak for her. There were exceptions. In Sparta, women enjoyed more freedom. They could own land, receive education, and walk freely. But Spartan women were the anomaly, not the rule. In most city-states, a respectable woman's name was supposed to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible. And yet, in the shadows of Greek law, women endured. They raised generations, managed households, and in some rare cases, wielded influence from behind the veil of legality. But officially, they weren't citizens. They were shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty for men only. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful instrument. And like everything else Roman, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and pragmatic. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any stretch, but compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patriotestas, or the absolute authority of her father. Upon marriage, that authority could either transfer to her husband, manus marriage, or remain with her natal family, sin manu marriage. The latter became increasingly common over time and allowed married women to retain legal ties to their original household and even manage property independently in some cases. This shift opened the door for women, especially widows, or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft contracts. While women could not vote or hold office, they could sue in court, often with a male sponsor, act as guardians, and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law drew a firm line around female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was Boudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once treated as a private offense, became a public crime under Augustus' moral reforms. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry, face exile, or worse. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained legally unproatic. Again, patriarchy rarely missed a chance to double down. However, unique roles offered exceptions. Vestals, the virgin priestesses of Vesta, were the only women legally free from male guardianship. They swore 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense prestige, legal independence, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. But a broken vow of chastity meant being buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons, respectable married women of the upper classes, held significant social power. They influenced politics through family connections, arranged marriages, and even public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged their status through protections for property and legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that, by the imperial period, was often symbolic. So while Roman women lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to allow movement, especially for those born into wealth and prestige. They were constrained, yes, but never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't merely a civic structure, it was divine instruction. Found in the Torah and later interpreted by rabbis. These religious legal texts created a framework that governed every aspect of life, including the roles, rights, and restrictions placed on women. And, like many ancient systems, the law both elevated and limited them. At the heart of Hebrew law was the family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, but always under male authority. Fathers arranged marriages, husbands were heads of households. Sons inherited land. Daughters, by contrast, were expected to marry out and bring a dowry with them, often with no inheritance rights unless there were no sons. However, women were far from voiceless. Cute, a marriage contract gave them legal security in the form of promised financial support and spelled out responsibilities in marriage. If a man failed to provide food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek divorce, a rare provision in the ancient world, but she couldn't initiate it directly. A rabbinic court or her male kin had to advocate on her behalf. Adultery laws were starkly unequal. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death according to Deuteronomic law. A man caught with a married woman, same punishment. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, the rules became murkier, usually resulting in fines or marriage, depending on the social status involved. In cases of rape, the law demanded a fine and marriage to the victim, an outcome that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a massive role in how women were legally perceived. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from religious life and physical contact. These laws reinforced ideas of female otherness, not necessarily as sinful, but as symbolically set apart. And yet, the Hebrew Bible is full of strong, legally significant women. Deborah, the judge; Ruth, the Moabite widow who navigates the inheritance system; and Esther, who bends royal law to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence reveals that the law wasn't always airtight, and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes make space where the law had closed. Door, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a vast, diverse population from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Medes. And in that sprawling empire, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism uncommon in many ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended in interesting ways to women. While Persian law wasn't codified in a single monument like Hammurabi's code, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions reveal that women, especially elite women, had considerable legal presence. In particular, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous in the ancient world. In the royal court, women like Atoza, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued commands to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions, not as decorative figures, but as landowners and power players. Records from the Pepololis fortification tablets show women receiving rations, managing work crews, and overseeing production in royal estates. These weren't isolated cases. High-ranking women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia combined local customs with overarching imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, enter contracts, and inherit land, rights that were sometimes even more secure than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if the marriage ended. Divorce was possible for both men and women, though the process often leaned in favor of the husband unless serious abuse or infertility could be proven. Punishment laws, however, were still gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women. But, unlike in some neighboring cultures, the method and severity of punishment varied by class. Noblewomen might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law, as always, vowed to hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the empire's dominant religion, also influenced Persian views on women. While spiritually, both men and women had roles in cosmic dualism. Practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions on menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact, echoing patterns seen in Hebrew and Hindu systems. In all, Persian law offered women a curious mix: freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. The higher your status, the louder your legal voice. In ancient China, law was not just a system of rules, it was an expression of harmony, hierarchy, and Confucian morality. And for women, this meant living within a legal and cultural framework that viewed them primarily through the lens of family roles and social duty rather than individual rights. The earliest codified Chinese laws appeared during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the Han dynasty 206 BCE, 220 CE, that legal structures began to crystallize alongside Confucian ideology. Confucian teachings emphasized the three obed. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. This wasn't just moral advice. It influenced actual legal expectations and societal norms. Women were legally subordinate to men in nearly all contexts. They could not hold public office, rarely appeared in court independently, and were often excluded from inheritance, especially in patrilineal families. A daughter might be cherished within the home, but the law saw her as temporary. She would eventually marry out, taking her dowry with her. Marriage was both a family alliance and a legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy or illness, though he could not do so if she had no family. 2. Return to had mourned his parents properly, or had borne him sons. Women, by contrast, had no legal power to initiate divorce unless extreme abuse could be proven, and even then, her case would likely depend on her male relatives stepping in. Adultery laws reflected strong gender bias. A woman caught cheating could be executed. A man cheating with a married woman might face punishment, but cheating with a servant or concubine that was often overlooked entirely. Its honor and legitimacy were tied tightly to the woman's womb. Still, there were exceptions. Some dynasties saw the rise of imperial women, like Empress Lu Ji and Empress Wu, who wielded immense political power, sometimes bending legal codes to suit their ambitions. And in peasant villages, widows who managed households or took over family businesses could wield informal authority, even if the law didn't formally recognize them. In short, ancient Chinese law saw women less as autonomous beings and more as stabilizers of familial order, vital to society's function, yet always second to the men who supposedly maintained its harmony. As we step back and look across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one thing becomes clear. Women were always written into the law, but rarely on their own terms. Nearly every ancient legal system assigned women a role within a male-dominated structure, whether in Hammurabi's Code or the Manusmriti. The fundamental legal assumption was that a woman's identity was relational. Daughter, wife, mother, widow. Her rights and responsibilities flowed through the men around her. Law defined her, but it rarely empowered her. Some civilizations, like Egypt and Persia, offered women more autonomy, allowing them to own property, initiate contracts, and even inherit wealth. In these societies, noble or high-born women could carve out pockets of legal authority, sometimes rivaling their male counterparts. But such privileges were far from universal. They depended on class, family, and circumstance more than any underlying belief in gender equality. Other societies, like Greece and Rome, developed sophisticated legal systems while simultaneously fencing women out of public life. Greek women were legally invisible. Roman women had more agency, but still lived within a scaffold of male guardianship and social expectation. Confucian values hardened the ideal of obedient femininity into legal expectation. The law wasn't just about punishment, it was about preserving cosmic harmony, and that meant everyone, especially women, knew their place in the social order. Similarly, in Hindu law, reverence for women coexisted uncomfortably with strict control and moral prescription. Religious laws, such as Jewish Hakka or Zoroastrian purity codes, often place women at the intersection of sacred and profane. A woman's body could bring honor or impurity, blessing, or danger, depending on how closely she followed the rules. And yet, within these systems, women adapted, resisted, and endured. They found ways to exercise influence through family, faith, property, or sheer determination. Their stories may not always be carved into stone steles or echoed in ancient law courts, but they moved beneath the surface, shaping households, dynasties, and entire civilizations. Ultimately, ancient legal codes tell us not only how societies treated women, but how they defined power itself, and who they believed deserved to wield it. Long before Wall Street, before vaults and banknotes and savings accounts, banking began in the mud brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And surprisingly, the first bankers weren't suited financiers. They were priests in cities like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon. Temples weren't just religious centers. They were the administrative and economic hearts of urban life. These towering ziggurats and their surrounding complexes acted as both spiritual sanctuaries and financial hubs. Farmers and merchants didn't just come to pray. They came to deposit grain, receive loans, and settle debts. Why temples? Because they were the most stable, trusted institutions. The gods didn't run off with your money, and the priesthood had an army of scribes to keep meticulous records. When a farmer delivered a portion of his harvest to the temple granary, he'd receive a clay tablet with an ununiform inscription, the quantity stored, the date, the depositor's name, and sometimes a witness. This wasn't just a receipt. It was an early form of a check. These receipts could then be transferred. A farmer in debt could hand over his tablet to a creditor as repayment. A merchant could use them to buy goods or settle accounts. In this way, the clay tablet became the ancestor of promissory notes, deposit slips, and IUS. Temples also issued loans, not just in grain, but in silver, sheep, and other commodities. Interest rates were high by modern standards, typically around 20% for grain and 33% for silver. These weren't casual transactions either. Defaulting on a temple loan could lead to the loss of land, property, or even personal freedom. Interestingly, the concept of compound interest was understood and feared. Some legal codes, like those of Hammurabi, tried to limit or regulate interest practices. Others formalized debt slavery as a punishment. This was banking in its rawest, most primal form, both brilliant and brutal. So, while modern banks might be glass towers and spreadsheets, their bones are ancient. The earliest financial systems weren't born in markets. They were born in temples. And in Mesopotamia, the gods didn't just judge your soul. They also balanced your books. By the time Babylon rose to power under kings like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, Mesopotamian banking had become more sophisticated and more personal. While temples and palaces remained important economic players, a new class of financial professionals began to emerge: private money lenders. These early financiers weren't working out of marble lobbies. They conducted business in humble homes, market stalls, or even beside temple courtyards. But they had one thing temples didn't: flexibility, where temple loans were often seasonal and tied to agricultural cycles. Private money lenders could tailor deals for merchants, traders, and craftsmen, offering loans in silver, Babylon's preferred unit of currency. Silver wasn't minted into coins yet. That innovation would come much later. Instead, it was weighed out by the shekel, and loans were documented on clay tablets. These tablets detailed the borrower, lender, amount lent, interest rate, repayment date, and sometimes even collateral. If a debtor defaulted, lenders could legally seize land, goods, or even family members. Some contracts read more like threats than agreements. One fascinating innovation was the rise of joint liability loans, where two or more individuals shared responsibility for repayment. This helped reduce the lender's risk and planted the seeds for what we now call co-signed loans. Debt was everywhere in Babylonian society. Farmers borrowed to plant crops. Merchants borrowed to finance. Caravan expeditions and builders took loans for large construction projects. Debt slavery was a real risk, but the law eventually began to push back. Hammurabi's famous code offered some relief. For example, if a storm destroyed your crops, you might be exempted from interest that season. Babylon also introduced promissory notes and letters of credit used to transfer money across distances without transporting physical silver. These tools allowed wealthy merchants to expand, trade, and move money without the risk of robbery, a protoform of the modern banking network. It's easy to think of banking as a modern system tied to stock tickers and interest rates. But in Babylon, the same mechanics, lending, collateral, interest, and risk, were already shaping lives and livelihoods. Their tools were made of clay, not code, but the game was much the same. In ancient Egypt, economic life revolved around two constants, the Nile River and the pharaoh's granaries. While Egypt didn't develop a formal banking system in the same way as Mesopotamia or later Greece, it nonetheless maintained sophisticated financial practices rooted in temples, royal treasuries, and massive state-administered storage systems. Instead of coins or silver shekels, Egypt's economy was built on grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often measured in sacks of grain, and these were stored in vast, centralized granaries. Like Babylonian temples, Egyptian temples functioned as both religious and economic centers, serving as secure storage sites and financial record offices. Scribes recorded every delivery, withdrawal, and transaction on ostrich, pottery, shards, or papyrus scrolls. These acted as receipts, contracts, and even early forms of checks. If you deposited 10 sacks of grain at the temple granary in Thebes, you might receive a receipt which could be traded or presented elsewhere to retrieve an equivalent amount. A precursor to modern bank drafts, loans were common. The farmer might borrow seed grain to plant in the spring with a promise of repayment after the harvest, usually with interest. Rates varied, but a 25–30% interest rate on grain wasn't unusual. These loans were enforced by scribes and local officials, and default could result in the forfeit of land, livestock, or even labor. Unlike Babylon, however, private lending in Egypt was more restricted. The state played a dominant role in organizing economic exchange. High officials, priests, and royal administrators were the main actors in large-scale financial activity. Yet, there are surviving records of private individuals, especially women, acting as lenders and creditors in local communities. These cases were less common, but they demonstrate a level of grassroots financial agency not often acknowledged. Coinage was introduced only during the late period, influenced by foreign powers like the Persians and later the Greeks. But even then, Egyptians preferred grain and barter systems over metal money. Proof that a functioning economy doesn't need coins, just trust, storage, and records. So, while Egypt lacked the sleek columns of a Roman bank or the aggressive contracts of Babylon, it ran a tight, temple-based economy built on grain, writing, and bureaucracy, and laid the groundwork for financial infrastructure that lasted thousands of years. The rise of city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE. Ancient Greece introduced two financial revolutions, the minted coin and the money changer. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, where grain and silver were the dominant currencies, the Greeks embraced metal coinage as a public standard, stamped, regulated, and guaranteed by the state. This shift created a new class of financial professionals, the trapezidi, named after the trapeza, or table, from which they worked in the bustling agora. These men functioned as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and sometimes outright financiers. They exchanged foreign coins, held money for safekeeping, offered loans, and even kept accounts for their clients, a rudimentary form of checking. Need to send money to another city-state? No problem. The trapezites could issue a written draft allowing merchants to avoid traveling with heavy, theft-prone coinage. If that sounds like a bank transfer, that's because it was, albeit with more sand and fewer algorithms. Lending was a huge part of Greek banking. Interest rates were generally high, especially for risky ventures like maritime trade. Some loans carried 100% interest justified by the danger of shipwreck, piracy, or storm. These were backed by maritime contracts which included details of the cargo, route, repayment, and collateral. PA, if the ship sank, the loan was voided, if it returned, big profits. Private citizens could also act as lenders. Wealthy Athenians often invested in smaller loans secured by property or slaves. These transactions were documented before witnesses and scribes and could be enforced in court. In fact, Greek courts were flooded with debt cases, an early sign that money, trust, and lawsuits are eternal bedfellows. And yet, banks in Greece weren't formal institutions like we'd expect today. They were more like financial freelancers with serious reputations. There were no licenses, no regulation, and no government insurance. If your trapezites skipped town with your deposit, too bad. Trust was everything, and it could be shattered in a heartbeat. Despite these risks, the Greek financial world thrived, enabled trade, supported empire building, and even bankrolled wars. In a city where logic and debate ruled, so too did contracts, ledgers, and interest rates. Ancient Greece taught us that once you stamp a coin and assign it value, the rest follows from debt and profit to risk and ruin. By the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, banking had evolved from small-scale loans to a full-blown financial engine that powered an empire. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, didn't invent banking, but they perfected it, expanded it, and embedded it deep into the fabric of everyday life. At the heart of Roman finance were the Argentari, the Roman equivalent of bankers. These men operated out of tabernae shops near the Forum and acted as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and agents. They exchanged coins from across the empire, held private deposits for safekeeping, paid out loans, and even executed payments between third parties. Wealthy Romans, including senators, deposited large sums with these bankers who kept ledgers called rationes, the ancestors of our modern account books. A client could authorize a banker to pay another person using their deposit, creating an early version of the check, to send money to Carthage or Alexandria. No need to pack a bag of coins. Your banker could issue a letter of credit. The real fuel behind Roman banking, however, was credit. Loans weren't just for emergencies. They were used for trade, land purchases, construction projects, even election campaigns. Lending at interest, usually around 12%, though it could be higher or lower, depending on risk, was legal, though subject to regulation. Usually, the charging of excessively high interest was frowned upon, but often ignored. Collateral was key. Land, slaves, or future earnings could all secure a loan. And Rome had robust legal enforcement. If you didn't pay your debts, you could be dragged to court, have your property seized, or, in extreme cases, be enslaved. Unlike earlier societies, Rome allowed corporations of financiers, known as societas publicanorum publicani, to handle large-scale government contracts, including tax collection. These were profit-seeking enterprises with investors, managers, and shareholders, making them eerily similar to modern banks and hedge funds. Yet, there were risks. Roman bankers weren't state-backed, and financial crises did happen. Records show that some banking houses collapsed, triggering waves of panic. Sound familiar? In the Roman world, money flowed through temples, forums, and estates, binding together farmers, traders, soldiers, and senators. And as the empire grew fat on conquest, its financial systems stretched like invisible roads, connecting people not with stone, but with credit, debt, and interest. Before the concept of a central bank existed, the idea of state control over currency was already revolutionizing how economies functioned. Okay? In ancient times, the power to mint coins wasn't just economic, it was political. Okay? Whoever issued the coin held the trust of the people, and that trust became the backbone of early banking systems. The earliest coins appeared in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, around 600 BCE, made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. These stamped pieces marked a shift from weighed metal to standardized currency. It's no more measuring silver chunks in a dusty market. Now value could be verified at a glance. Other civilizations quickly adopted the idea. The Greeks minted dramas, the Persians issued dar, and the Romans built an entire empire on denarii. These coins bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, and inscriptions, not just to represent value, but to signal legitimacy and control. A coin was as much a piece of propaganda as it was a financial tool. With state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Cords of coins were stored in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more portable. Coins could circulate quickly across city-states, and, with uniform weights and metal content, traders could move goods across borders with confidence. In turn, early bankers, from Mesopotamian lenders to Roman argenti, adapted to this new certainty. They no longer needed to test weights or purity as frequently. Instead, they tracked coins by type, year, and issuer. This consistency reduced transaction friction, expanded trade routes, and made loans more predictable. Coinage also played a role in inflation and monetary policy, albeit in crude forms. Rulers could debase coins by mixing cheaper metals into the mix, stretching the treasury, but undermining trust. Roman emperors famously did this to pay their armies, triggering cycles of devaluation and economic instability. Still, the idea stuck. Currency backed by a state, stamped with its symbol and guaranteed in value. This concept laid the groundwork for everything from medieval gold coins to modern fiat money. In a way, each ancient coin was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a tool of empire. It told you not only how much something was worth, but who had the power to decide. In the ancient world, the line between faith and finance was often thin, if it existed at all. Temples didn't just serve the gods, they also served as the earliest safe deposit boxes, banks, and loan offices. Why? Because people trusted the gods far more than they trusted kings, merchants, or wandering moneylenders. Take Delphi, for instance. The sanctuary of Apollo wasn't just a religious destination. It was a financial powerhouse. City-states stored war funds there. Wealthy individuals deposited fortunes in treasuries were built within temple precincts. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also acted as de facto banks, offering security, prestige, and scribes, who kept careful records. A vault under divine watch was seen as safer than any home or fortress. These temples played several financial roles. They held deposits, issued loans, and in some cases even collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests oversaw lending systems where borrowers repaid with grain or silver. In Egypt, temple granaries stored wealth, issued receipts, and facilitated trade. In Greece and Rome, temples frequently held public funds, safeguarded spoils of war, and underwrote construction and festivals, all under the sacred seal of a deity. And temples weren't just passive vaults, they actively lent money. In Athens, for example, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis loaned silver to the state at interest to fund major public works. Gods, apparently, were patient creditors. Religion also provided the ethical framework for finance. Ancient Hebrew law, for instance, prohibited charging interest to fellow Israelites, but allowed it for foreigners, a moral boundary that blended spiritual identity with economic policy. Hindu Dharma texts laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misconduct. Of course, these systems weren't without flaws. Temples could be looted in wartime. Clerics could be corrupt. But for most of the ancient world, temples were the most trusted institutions, enduring, stable, and reinforced by divine fear. So, when you picture ancient banking, don't just imagine dusty coins and cloaked lenders. Picture golden statues, incense, and marble columns. 'Cause for thousands of years, the safest place to put your money wasn't under a mattress. It was beneath the watchful eyes of the gods, long before the invention of credit, cards, or mortgage calculators. Ancient economies ran on a system that was surprisingly familiar. Borrow now, pay later with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed capital, you went to a lender. But the ancient rules of lending were often harsher, and the consequences of default far more personal. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were steep. 20% for grain, 33% for silver, often compounded annually. These figures weren't considered predatory, they were standard. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers understood that if the harvest failed or a caravan didn't return, they were still on the hook. Temples and private lenders alike made fortunes off these loans, and unpaid debt could lead to debt slavery or seizure of property. In ancient Greece, especially Athens, interest rates varied depending on the risk involved. The riskiest loans, maritime loans. A lender might front silver to fund a trading voyage, knowing the ship might sink or be seized by pirates. To offset the risk, rates could soar to 100% or more. But if the ship returned safely, both merchant and lender could make a killing. The Romans added legal muscle to these arrangements. Loan contracts were written, witnessed, and sealed. Collateral land, goods, slaves was recorded in detail. Miss a payment? Your creditor could take you to court, seize your property, or, in rare cases, force you into bonded labor. Roman law set a 12% interest cap, but loopholes and exemptions made that number flexible, especially during times of economic stress. Despite the risk, borrowing was common. Farmers borrowed seed. Merchants borrowed to buy goods. Politicians borrowed to fund their campaigns. Lending greased the gears of ancient economies, and default was an accepted hazard. And yes, fraud and manipulation were part of the game. Lenders sometimes demanded bribes or added administrative fees. Borrowers could lie about collateral or disappear entirely. Without credit scores or banking regulations, trust and reputation were everything. In the end, ancient loans weren't just financial tools. They were power plays. To borrow was to risk more than money. It was to stake your land, your freedom, sometimes even your family on the chance that tomorrow would be better or at least profitable. From grain receipts in Mesopotamia to the silver ledgers of Rome, ancient banking wasn't just a footnote in economic history. It was the foundation. These early systems of deposits, loans, interest, and financial record-keeping didn't just fuel local trade. They quietly shaped the architecture of global finance. At the heart of every ancient banking system was the same challenge we face today: trust. Could people trust that the weight of silver was fair? That the grain in the temple granary wouldn't spoil or vanish? That the lender wouldn't disappear with their deposit? And out of that trust, or the desperate need for it, rose record-keeping, contracts, and ultimately institutional finance. The innovations were astonishing for their time. Ancient Babylonians developed loan contracts with fixed interests, repayment terms, and legal witnesses, all inscribed in uniform. Ancient Greeks pioneered letters of credit, allowing funds to be transferred between city-states without carrying coins. The Romans created bankers' associations and formalized debt enforcement in civil law, building a financial system that could stretch from Britain to Syria. Even today, echoes of ancient banking remain. The modern check evolved from Mesopotamian clay receipts. The concept of collateralized loans is rooted in Babylonian in Roman practices. Central banking and monetary policy trace their ancestry back to rulers who manipulated coin, purity, or temple wealth to fund armies and public projects. And what about regulation? Well, it turns out ancient societies understood financial crisis all too well. In Babylon, kings periodically declared debt forgiveness to prevent social collapse. Roman emperors sometimes imposed interest caps to curb predatory lending. Okay. These weren't just economic decisions. Okay. They were political acts aimed at keeping society balanced and stable. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient banking is the realization that finance is not new. The tools have changed. Okay. Tablets became spreadsheets. Silver shekels became digital currencies. Tays. But the fundamental human behaviors remain. Risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the hope of gain. The next time you log into your bank app or swipe a credit card, remember, you're not doing anything new. You're participating in a system that began with scribes in temples, coins stamped by kings, and farmers betting their harvest on a better season. And it all began with a simple idea. Sometimes to build the future, you have to borrow from it.